And one of my favorite stories is about Frenchie McCormick, who this is what she did. That she was a saloon girl. She had a French accent, and that's how she got her name. She never told anybody where she was from, although they suspect it was New Orleans. She had been a dance hall girl in various places. She came to Old Mobile, and she was working there, and she was dealing. And there was this guy named Mickey, who actually was living in Tascosa, but he would drive over to Mobile to gamble, to do business, and he carried people back and forth. And he noticed that whenever he played at her table, he won. So she was lucky for him. So he started spending more and more time at her table, and they got to know each other, and they fell in love, and they got married, and then moved to Mobile, or to Tascosa from Mobile, and lived happily ever after. And as soon as she got married, it's like she just left that whole other life behind. She was always completely faithful to Mickey. She was the last resident of Tascosa. She lived there until her children forced her to move away, living there in the house that he had built for her. So it's a very romantic story in a lot of ways. Frenchie McCormick is one of the icons, I guess, of the Wild West and the Panhandle. So in Mobile, you had all of these businesses going on, and you also had some respectable businesses going on, grocery stores, dry goods stores, things like that. And those merchants had wives and families who did not like living in a Wild West town with all of these Wild West women running around. So the women got together and sent messages to churches that they had come from back east, wherever they had come from, asking them to please send somebody to found a church here. If we get churches here, maybe the bad element will leave. Maybe, and we'll have a better life here. And churches did that. One in particular was Reverend C.W. Alexander, who was a Presbyterian minister. He had grown up in Missouri, and he had actually been teaching at Sherman College in North Texas for a while when he was told to go to Mobile to start a church. And so he did, and he went, and he stayed there for a year or so without his family. They stayed back in Sherman, where it was civilized, until he had gotten them a place to live and got settled. And then he went back to Sherman to get them, to bring them to Mobile. Okay, map again. Sherman, Mobile. So you have to cross a couple of rivers to get there. And they were in a wagon. And they came to the Pease River. And until this past spring, I would never have believed it, but the Pease River was in full flood and raging when they crossed it. It was full last spring. I saw it. It had not been the previous 10 years I'd been living in the Panhandle. Now it's mostly dirt. But then they'd had rainstorms, and it was full and flooded, but they had to get across it. And so they started across, the horse, pulling the wagon. The horse got into some quicksand, and sort of the wagon was doing this, and a big tree came down the river and bashed into the wagon. And the Reverend was sitting up in front driving the horses, and he fell out into the water. He managed, fortunately he was upstream, he managed to grab onto the horse harness and pull himself up out of the water and hang on until the horse got him across. His wife, Mary Jane Alexander, was also thrown out of the carriage, the wagon, and she'd been holding their baby. But as she was thrown forward, she grabbed the baby with one arm and grabbed onto the wagon tongue with the other and managed to keep both of their heads out of the water until the horses got across. So they all made it, but the Reverend got water in his lungs. And he had trouble with his lungs for another year or so, and then he was out riding circuit and got caught in a cold rainstorm, and he caught pneumonia, and he died. That left Mary Jane a widow with small children. And she made a decision that was very unusual. She did not get remarried, which is what most widows did. She did not move back east to her family in Missouri. She homesteaded on some land that was right up next to the Oklahoma Indian Territory border. She got 2 sections of land and started farming and ranching. Not much farming at first. The farming was gathering hay, so hay farming. The older boys were teenagers, and they would go out and gather hay and twist it up into bundles and take it into Fort Elliott to sell to the soldiers. She would also gather wild plums. There was a creek that ran through that land, and she would gather the wild plums that grew there and make jelly out of it. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever made jelly, but she had the plums. You could get sugar. Sugar could come in by freight train or by wagon. You could get the pectin, but there was no glass. Jelly jars were not profitable enough to put on a wagon to take to the frontier. So she had to come up with a way to sell the jelly, right, to package it. So she got creative. She went into Mobeetie during the day when most everybody was asleep and went around behind the saloons and picked up the bottles that were just sort of cast aside when they were empty. And she took them home and cleaned them out thoroughly because she was a very faithful religious woman. She didn't want any alcohol. She cleaned them out very thoroughly. And then she would get string and dip it in kerosene and tie the string around the bottle, light it on fire, and then as soon as the fire went out, plunge it into a bucket of water. And the top would just pop off. And I see y'all looking at me. You don't think it would work. I had to try it myself. It does work. And so she would get these, and make jelly jars out of them, and cover them and sell these either in Mobeetie or to the soldiers at Fort Elliott. She was very entrepreneurial, very creative. They started rounding up the wild cattle, and the cowboys who were working on some of the big ranches nearby would come and help out because she was a wonderful, wonderful woman, apparently. And they just wanted to talk to a woman who was, a good woman. And so they would bring cattle out to her place at her ranch. And so they started their herd with these just sort of found longhorns that were just drifting around all over the place. Her second son, R.T. Alexander, apparently had a knack for breeding cattle. And he started bringing Herefords into the mix and breeding up and breeding up and breeding up until finally he had one of the finest Hereford herds in the country. So it started out with Mary Jane as owning this land in her own name. So she was the first woman rancher in the Panhandle. So I like her. She was amazing. Other women who were of the elite were the wives who were married to ranch managers and ranch owners. So cattlemen's wives. They lived in houses. They supervised staff. This was a very middle-class existence out on the frontier. So they had rugs on the floors. They had paintings on the walls. They had glass in their windows. It was still hard. I mean, cooking was still over a wood or buffalo chip-fired stove. But these women had it a little bit easier than the lower-class women. And my example for this is Cornelia Adair. If you're from around here, you've probably heard of her. She was married to John A. Adair, one of the partners in the J.A. Ranch in Palo Duro Canyon. She had grown up in the American aristocracy, the highest levels of society. She married a British aristocrat. They traveled around the world. She moved in the highest circles, but she loved the Panhandle. And she came out here every summer, and she would ride, and she'd go out with the cowboys when they were doing the roundups and the brandings and the taking parts off and everything. She just loved it. She loved being out here. And then when her husband died, she wanted to take over running of the ranch. Charles Goodnight, who was a ranch manager, didn't like the idea of a woman being in charge, and so they kind of butted heads a little bit. He ended up leaving and founding his own ranch, and then she took over running the J.A. Ranch, and it's still in her family today. So that's another example of one of these wonderful women in the Panhandle that you just don't even try to say no to because it doesn't work.